Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Melbourne Accelerator program's first masterclass for 2014. My name is Alexander Ryan, and I'm an associate of MAP. The masterclass series provides practical advice to early stage startup founders on the day-to-day challenges of running a small business. Sessions are held every second Wednesday from 5:30 to 6:30 in Brown Theatre, right here. Today we'll be hearing from Rohan Workman, who is the current, who described the current entrepreneurial ecosystem. Rohan is the manager of the Melbourne Accelerator program and is the director of Roster Cloud, a HR management software company. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rohan.
Thanks, Alex. Good evening, everyone, and welcome down to the first masterclass for MAP of 2014. As Alex mentioned, today we'll be going over some of the basics of the startup ecosystem in Australia, some resources for you, and also just some places you can look for funding, resources available to you if you're trying to grow a business. Before we do get into the nitty-gritty, I just wanted to briefly run over what the Melbourne Accelerator program is. Given that this is the first event for 2014, there might be some of you who aren't familiar with MAP and how we operate. So there's kind of two tranches to MAP. The first are the non-accelerator activities, so the support for entrepreneurs of all stages. And what we do is we have public forums, which are big public events to inspire people to start businesses. Our first public event or public forum is next Tuesday at the Woodward Conference Centre, and we've got Steve Blank, who will be our guest from Silicon Valley. We've got the masterclass series, obviously this is the first of them. We also have our feeder programs, which are designed to be intensive entrepreneurship boot camps to really give the fundamentals of entrepreneurship, and then some more advanced techniques through Escape Velocity, which is a graduate program of Startup Velocity. In terms of the MAP Startup Accelerator, the best startups on campus are granted access through a competitive selection process to the MAP Startup Accelerator, and you get $20,000 structured mentoring and co-working space. We're having a big information night on the 25th of March and highly encourage all of you to come down. We'll be running through all of the details of MAP and how it all operates there in a bit more detail. I'll be tweeting out these slides later on tonight or tomorrow morning, and that's a link for the info night there, but the link is also on the Melbourne Accelerator program website. So before we can talk, what we will be talking about today is what a startup is and an ecosystem is, if we're going to talk about the startup ecosystem. We'll be talking about the life cycle of a startup and also the different categories of funding that are available to a startup as it progresses from just an idea to a fully fledged business. We'll be talking about funding sources, government support from both the Australian federal government, the Victorian state government, and also governments from overseas, and also some not-for-profits that are in Australia to help budding entrepreneurs. So, firstly, we need to define what a startup is. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Quora, it's a social network where people can post questions and others can post answers to those questions, and answers can be upvoted by other users. Dave McClure, who is an incredibly well-known entrepreneur, answered this question about what is a startup, and his answer was the most popular, which is why I've used it here today. So he said that a startup is a company that is confused about what its product is, who its customers are, and how to make money. And once it's figured out those things, it's moved from being a startup to being a real business. Today, I'm not going to talk about how to determine what your product is or who your customers are or how to make money. They're the subject for other masterclasses and also the Startup Velocity and Startup Escape Velocity programs, and they're quite involved. If you get into the MAP Startup Accelerator, we'll be working with you on that every day for 4 months to try and help you achieve that. It's very hard to do, but those who make it work obviously do very well. The key thing to note from this slide is that a startup is not a small business and it's not a massive corporation, but it has the potential to be both. It is a vessel, so to speak, on the way to finding out if a business can be viable, and if it is, it might grow into a small business or it might grow into a massive corporation. Don't use a startup and a small business synonymously. And then we can talk about a startup ecosystem. Now, there's a great book written by Brad Feld about startup communities, and I'd encourage all of you to read it if you do have a really deep-seated interest in startup communities. But startup communities are made up of a number of different nodes, and those nodes are listed here along the left-hand side. Obviously, you need entrepreneurs in order to have a startup community. Government plays an important role, but don't look to them for leadership because they're too slow. Universities. Obviously, you have a large cluster of intelligent people with diverse skill sets at universities. Putting those people together with diverse backgrounds to solve problems can come up with some amazing solutions. The bionic ear is a tremendous example of that from the University of Melbourne. It took medical talent, it took engineering talent and business talent to put that together, and you can see the results every day with people who have now got hearing because of that. Investors obviously fund startups. We've also got mentors, and mentors I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail. If there's one really key point from this slide, it's about mentors. We touched on in the last slide that a startup is not a small business and it's not a massive corporation. When you have a business that you have started, when you have a startup, it is vital to have startup mentoring, not business mentoring. When you start a business, there are a lot of people who are, well, they will think that they're qualified to give you advice because they've been incredibly successful in business. But I can guarantee you, not every CEO of every listed company will give you good advice when you start your business. It's important to take every piece of advice that you get with a grain of salt, no matter who's giving it to you, because you'll get diverse ranges of advice from diverse people. You want somebody who can help you find out what your product is, who your customers are, and how to make money. And that type of mentor is very different from someone who may have been successful running a large corporation. Service providers are also incredibly important. Service providers could be Google, Gmail for Business. It's a very cheap and easy way to have a domain or an email account set up with your business name as the last part of it. There's also companies like Amazon Web Services that provide credits to startups to help them with their server infrastructure. And those types of companies, there's a lot of free resources available to startups because their rationale is that if you go into a large business and you've used their infrastructure from the outset, then they'll earn a lot of money from you later down the track. And large companies invest in startups and they also buy startups. Obviously, they play an important role in the ecosystem. This is a great diagram of the startup financing cycle, and I'm going to talk about this now and also a little bit later on after I've gone through the different funding types. The key points at this time are that initially, when a startup is getting off the ground, the initial sources of capital will be seed capital. As the name suggests, that's your first source. That can include angels, FFF, accelerators, which I'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail as we go through the evening. Then you can move on to venture capital, both early stage and later stage venture capital. And eventually, if a startup gets there, you might list it on an exchange, the Australian Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, or you might even have a trade sale where a larger corporation buys you. But as you can see, they've got this valley of death down here, which is an interesting thing. A lot of startups don't get through the valley of death. As you can see, it's quite difficult to find out who your customers are, what your business model should be, and what your product is. And the ones who get out of that valley of death are managed to go on to build great businesses, but even then, there are still challenges. You'll also find that when a company gets to where that red line crosses the first early stage venture capital part, you'll also find right then that's when they're starting to pour fuel on the fire. And a lot of the funding that they raise will go to marketing and sales to really generate a large amount of revenue. But I will talk about this again once I've gone through the different funding sources. Seed funding is a category of funding, and there's a few different types of seed funding. It's very early stage, which is therefore risky. They talk about friends, fools, and family. That's F, F, and F. They're generally the initial types of investors, but that happens quite a lot. Atlassian, which is a huge company which was started in Sydney, was started with, I think, $25,000 of credit card debt that the founders took on. Even Facebook, you know that one of the co-founders got some funding from his family to help pay for the server costs initially. So it's not uncommon for founders to ask their friends and family and others for funding. Accelerators, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well, are a great source of seed funding, and you can potentially do crowdfunding as well. I'll talk about accelerators and crowdfunding and FF&F a little bit more, but they're all part of the seed funding category. Accelerators. So a startup accelerator is generally a program where an organisation will give you funding, office space and mentoring over a finite period of time, generally 3, 4, maybe 5 months. And the MAP Startup Accelerator is a good example of that. There are privately run and not privately run accelerators. Angel Cube, which is an accelerator here in Melbourne, and StartMate, which is an accelerator in Sydney, are both great examples of a privately run accelerator. They are run by entrepreneurs who are trying to seed more entrepreneurship, and what they do is they'll provide funding and they'll take equity in exchange for providing that funding, the office space and the mentoring. And their aim is to make a financial return on those investments so that they can fund future batches in their accelerator. The University of Melbourne, so with MAP, we don't actually take any equity. We're not looking for a financial return, we're looking for a cultural return. What we would like to see is more people starting businesses, and to that extent, we provide the funding, the office space and mentoring. We don't take equity, but we do instill a pay it forward principle, which means that if you are successful, we do ask that you give that opportunity to others so that they can also have that opportunity in future years. Ignition Labs is more of a hardware and medtech based startup out of Sydney. Small Technologies Cluster here, STC, is one in Melbourne, that's in Scoresby, and that helps with medtech as well. So now starting to see in Australia startup accelerators that aren't just broad startup accelerators, but ones that are specific for medtech or other types of technologies. And this ANZ Startup Accelerator is actually based out of Sydney, or not Sydney, Adelaide. So Adelaide is now starting to grow their startup ecosystem, which is pleasing. Friends, fools and family, I've already kind of touched on that. Again, it's a great way to get early investment. It's very risky and a lot of the times I won't get paid back. But if you've got family who would like to support you, if you've got friends who think it's a great idea, then try what you can to get them on board and get your business off the ground. Angel funding. So angel investors are generally high net worth individuals who have funds to invest in startups. And they probably have startup experience. So you find that a lot of angel investors have gone on and have started a business, exited it successfully, or made a lot of money from it, and now want to either take on the risk and the enjoyment of helping future generations of entrepreneurs, or they might be looking for a financial return as well. There's a large amount of risk associated with that. Generally, angel investors will take a portfolio approach. They realise that only one in every few startups will pay off and pay off well. But they're the characteristics of an angel investor. There are also angel networks, and there are many of them in Australia. An angel network is a collection of angels, and what they'll do is they'll review deals together, but they'll make their decision as to whether or not to invest by themselves. And there's benefits to being part of an angel network. You think about the infrastructure if you're an angel investor. If you're a angel by yourself, you need to rely on people knowing that you're an angel investor and coming to you with potential deals. Whereas Melbourne Angels and Scale and all these types of places have websites where people will find them if they Google. Melbourne Angels have been active in Melbourne for a very long time. Aurelius Digital is a fantastic organisation that's actually run by a couple of venture capitalists here in Melbourne. And what they do is they put on a dinner every quarter. And they invite 150 or so angel investors to dinner, and they have 3 or 4 startups pitched to those investors, startups that have been curated and are investable. Scale is also another initiative that has recently got off the ground in Australia. It's about a year old and it's a fantastic initiative. Scale is a female-focused angel network. What that means is they will support investments or startups that have a female with significant equity holding, so a female as one of the co-founders. That's really important because there's a really large shortage of females in entrepreneurship, and that's something that we're trying to change. And they're doing it in a very good way as well, so they support them through office hours and all that sort of stuff. So if you are a female entrepreneur and you'd like to talk to someone about your business, every second Friday, Scale have got open hours at their office. You can go there and talk to their team. There's a Sydney Angels Network, and there's some others in Adelaide, in Brisbane and Perth as well. Venture capital is probably the source of funding that most of you would be familiar with from the media and having grown up and seen the news, tech news about Facebook getting invested in, from investment from venture capital. Basically, what a venture capital firm will do is they will pool a lot of money from an institutional investor or perhaps a really high net worth individual. It could also be from a family office. The Myers and the Balliers have family offices, and they might invest in a venture capital firm. The venture capital firm will take that money, and then invest it in emerging businesses. It's still quite risky, but there's probably a lesser amount of risk than angel investors or seed investors. And there are some good examples of venture capital firms in Australia, which we can run through here. A lot of people, when they start businesses in Australia, don't understand where the venture capitalists are and what they invest in. It's really important when you are approaching a venture capital firm or any type of investor that you take the time to understand how much they invest and in what categories they're likely to invest. So Starfish Ventures is based here in Melbourne. It's in East Melbourne. And one of the members of the MAP advisory board is actually an investment director there, Tony Glenning. Adventure Capital is an early stage venture capital firm, and that is based in York Street. So that venture capital firm will invest probably around up to $500,000, whereas companies like Southern Cross Venture Partners invest much later on. So if you're looking to raise $3 or $4 million, you probably wouldn't go to Adventure Capital. You're more likely to go to Southern Cross Venture Partners. Brandon Capital Partners invests in medical technology, and so does GBS. That's a life sciences venture capital firm here in Melbourne. Square Peg Capital was started by Paul Bassett, who you might know started Seek. Obviously made a lot of money from that, and he's trying to encourage future generations of entrepreneurs. And one of the efforts that he's been involved with is Square Peg Capital. UniSeed is a venture capital firm actually operated by the Universities of New South Wales, Queensland, and the University of Melbourne, and they'll invest in technology developed at the University of Melbourne. Blackbird and One Ventures are both venture capital firms located in Sydney. So coming back to this diagram, I'll kind of talk through each of the stages of funding that are available, but you can see that angels, friends, fools, and family and accelerators form part of the seed capital. And then if you get through that and you're looking to raise larger amounts of money, then you can get to venture capital. There is overlap. So if you raise seed capital, some accelerators might give you $150,000 in capital, which is considered a large amount of seed capital. And venture capitalists might come in as low as $200,000 or $300,000. But generally, you'd see that seed capital would go up to maybe a couple $100,000, including angel investment, and then beyond that, up from 200 to 500 would probably be angel investment, and 500 plus you're looking more around the venture capital mark. But there is overlap between various venture capitalists and also angel investors, and it does change from company to company. Crowdfunding. I'm sure all of you have seen Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and Possible, and perhaps supported campaigns through them. So this is the practice of funding a project through a large amount of small donations through an online platform. So the key thing about these platforms are that they are pre-sales, and a good example of this is Swatchmate. Swatchmate is a company that went through the MAP Startup Accelerator last year, and they've created a device that can scan any surface and determine its exact colour. So it's capturing colour and digitising it. So it's a physical device that links to your iPhone and tells you, what that colour is. Because they need to manufacture that, they didn't have the money to go ahead and build it straight away. And they also didn't want to take a risk on building something that no one wanted to buy. So what they did is they did a Kickstarter campaign, and last year they put up a profile on Kickstarter. It was one of the first that was done through Kickstarter Australia, not Kickstarter US, because Kickstarter Australia only launched in November last year. And they had a video about their product. So what they did is they actually had a goal of $50,000, but they were able to raise $100,000, which is great evidence that people wanted to buy their product. And so $100,000 worth of sales, so it's pre-sales, were obtained by Swatchmate to allow them to go and manufacture their product. Since then, they've also done an Indiegogo campaign and raised a further $50,000. There are differences between Kickstarter and Indiegogo and Possible, and I won't go into the details there, but it's important to know that these types of platforms are great opportunities for you to, first of all, validate your idea. So firstly, acknowledge that people, confirm that people want to buy what you're making, and secondly, raise funds to then go and make it. From the other side, the people who support these types of projects are generally very early adopters, and they see cool projects and they want to support them. Some of these projects never get built, so there is an element of risk there. But often a lot of these projects wouldn't get built without the support of the early pledges from these crowdfunding platforms. There's also equity crowdfunding, which is not as prevalent at the moment. There's some regulation that needs to kind of unwind itself there. Basically, instead of being pre-sales, this is crowdfunding for equity. In Australia, there's Venture Crowd and ASOB, the Australian Small Scale Offerings Board, and the other logos up here for Startup Valley and Crowdfund and Crowdcube and all those sorts of places are overseas. The reason why there's a bit of a regulation to be overcome in this area is that they're very wary of people putting up a profile for a startup on these platforms and allowing any investor to invest in them and then the person fraudulently taking that money and running off with it. So at the moment it's only open to sophisticated investors and there's certain definitions around that. It's not open to everybody, but there is some reform going on in that area, but that'll take a little time because there's obviously, that's a government legislation that needs to change. Co-working spaces are also a very important part of the startup ecosystem, and the reason for that is many startups can't afford their own office. And they also allow people, entrepreneurs to pay for desks on just a desk on a month-by-month arrangement. It might be a few $100s for a desk. But that also includes internet, printing, a kitchen and all these sorts of things. And these are some examples of co-working spaces from around Melbourne. You've got Collins Collective, which is at the Paris and Collins Street, York Butter Factory, which is in King Street, one of the larger ones, Inspire 9 in Richmond, The Hub, which is at the end of Burke Street, and a few others that are in Melbourne. The other key benefit of a co-working space is that if you have a lot of entrepreneurs working on different problems from those co-working spaces, there's also a lot of shared resources and information. So if you have a question around how to use Google Ads to obtain a customer, chances are some other entrepreneur is going through the same thing or has already and can give you some help. So they're a great place for people to kind of work together, collaborate, connect, and solve problems or get help on problems that they need to solve. There's a lot of government support for entrepreneurs, and a lot of people don't know about this government support, but you really should because there's a hell of a lot of it. There's support from both the federal government, the state government, and also overseas government. I'm going to run through a few of those things today. The first is Commercialisation Australia. This is a federal government agency that provides a few different types of grants to entrepreneurs. Now, with the change of government, there is some question over whether or not this will remain in place, and for the time being it is, but it might not be we don't know how much longer it might be around if the government decides to keep it. But basically what these guys will do is they'll provide, of the 4 different grants, they'll provide up to $50,000 for skills and knowledge, $350,000 for you to hire an experienced executive. So if you're looking for a CEO to come on board who might have big corporate experience and might be able to help you take the company from being a solid startup into an established business, and you need an executive that can help with that. Proof of concept is probably for more technological startups where they need to really prove the technology behind something, and also early stage commercialization. I won't go into a whole lot of details around these, but just want to say that they are there. If you're interested in finding out more, go to the Commercialisation Australia website and have a look at the eligibility restrictions around those types of grants. Generally, they require you to match the funding that they provide you one for one. So if you want early stage commercialisation of $2 million, then you need to raise $2 million from other funding sources. There's also the R&D Tax Incentive, which a lot of entrepreneurs are not aware of. What this allows is people to claim a deduction on their investment in R&D. And if you're developing a software company, that includes the development of that software. So if you have a company that turns over less than $20 million per annum, which is probably most of you, then you're eligible for up to a 150% deduction in the following year. And there's a few boxes you need to tick. Basically, it needs to be more than $20,000, and you do need to lodge the application with AusIndustry by the 30th of April. Now, there are R&D tax consultants. It's a little bit tricky to get your head around. If any of you do want to claim the R&D tax incentive and you're looking where to, you don't know where to go, come and find me and I can give you the contact details of some R&D tax consultants that we work with. Business Victoria also does a lot to support entrepreneurship and support startups. Now, this is obviously a Victorian government initiative, and they've got a few different grants here. The TRIP ICT grant allows people who have got an export-ready business to go and attend a conference overseas, and I've used this myself to go to South by Southwest last year. They start at $2,500 for a networker grant, literally just to go to a conference and network with people. and that goes up to $10,000 if you're actually exhibiting at a conference. Now, any internet business is an export-ready business because you can sell overseas. You do need to put together an export grant, and there is a bit of work involved, but it's a great opportunity to go and network at one of these events or conferences, or even exhibit at one and get some money from the government to help you do that. And I do know a lot of entrepreneurs or even accelerators who have very close connections with the Victorian government to take their startups over to Silicon Valley, to London, or even to Asia to attend these types of conferences. And it's not limited to just one time per year per company. I think you can access it around 4 times every 3 financial years or 3 times every 2 financial years. But the details are all on the website. There's also the same thing for biotechnology and small technology. So if you're looking for some money and you're in the biotech space and you want to go to a conference, you can use that. And there's also the technology voucher program. One of the companies that went through MAP Accelerator last year, Cortero Neurotechnologies, is a medical tech device. It's got some technology voucher programs from the government as well to help with the development of their product. There's more detail at Business Victoria, and if you Google any of these types of grants, you'll come across them. There's also Invest Victoria, which is for some reason very it's not very widely publicised, basically. The Victorian government is very keen to promote Victoria as an economic hub. And so what Invest Victoria does is mainly 2 things. One, they help Victorian businesses, not Australian, but Victorian businesses, get overseas. And 2, they're trying to attract their biggest companies who are setting up an Asia Pac office to Victoria. The Victorian government has offices in all of these locations. And I've met with a team in San Francisco, and they do a lot. So basically, if you are looking to get into the American market, you can contact the team in San Francisco, and they'll set you up. They'll help you with your pitch. They'll help you find out who you might be able to speak to in terms of finding funding from venture capitalists over there. They'll help you with channel partners to distribute your product. And they've also got networks that are very well developed in those regions. And they've also got obviously strong ties to the offices in the other American cities. If you're looking to go to Asia or Europe, they're also there as well. But it's a fantastic initiative and a great way for you to get over to those countries and have basically somebody who's on your team without having to pay for them. They will help you out because they're keen for Victorian companies to grow. Another one which you probably haven't come across is the UK Trade and Investment Commission. This is obviously a UK government body. But what they do is they're keen, like Invest Victoria, for companies to start offices in the UK. So I met with the team behind the UK Trade and Investment last year, and if you can prove to them that you're looking at setting up an office in, say, the UK, they can help you figure out where is best to set up an office depending on what kind of business you're doing and what kind of talent you need in terms of staffing. But they'll also, dedicate more resources to you, the more significant the opportunity for them is. So if you're going to have more than 7 employees in the UK, they'll go out of their way to help you find those employees, set up shop, find office space in the right locale. And there's probably other organisations like this as well, from not just the UK government, but other governments, because a lot of them are trying to attract new businesses to create jobs in their regions. So there's more information on the UK Trade and Investment Commission website. In terms of not-for-profits, I'm not sure how many of you might have heard of Startup Australia, but it was started by a few people in Sydney from Google and also some other venture capitalists. And it's basically, the big thing that they do is they're trying to promote entrepreneurship and put some publicity around it. They also lobby government, and they also have what's called Startup Spring. So every spring they have Startup Spring, and all of the events that happen around the startup community in Australia are put onto the Startup Spring website, and they try and draw some media to that and publicity to that. That's a relatively new thing. It's only started last year, but so far it's done pretty well. And there's another one as well called Startup Victoria. Startup Victoria is unique. There's no other not-for-profits in Australia like Startup Victoria. And there's not like Startup New South Wales or anything. And they actually had their inaugural meeting earlier this week. So they've got government funding and some other seed funding to help them hire a CEO and promote entrepreneurship in Victoria. You can see there that their mantra is more founders and better founders, and to that extent they're going to run a number of different events and activities and all these sorts of things to try and help broaden the number of people becoming involved in entrepreneurship, but also the quality of those people becoming involved in entrepreneurship. And there's various committees. The way that this system works is they have the membership, and then they have committees, and people on the committees will take on certain tasks and projects, and then they have a board which people from the committees can get elected to at the end of each year. Some of the committees include events and membership and sponsorship, but there's other ones around, for example, Asia Pacific. So they've actually got somebody who's committed to growing the ties between Melbourne and the Asia Pacific region for the benefit of startups. So that's a really good initiative of a few of the entrepreneurs around Melbourne, a few of the leaders from Melbourne who are looking to help develop the Melbourne startup ecosystem. Now, there are a few of the resources available to startups, and that's it for today. It's just mainly an introduction to the startup ecosystem. There's more information on all of those topics and resources on their websites, but I didn't want to go into too much detail today. Thank you very much for coming down. We've got another masterclass in two weeks on global tech trends and thinking big. They'll be happening every second week at 5:30 p.m. in the Brown Theatre. I hope you can come down. And we've also got an Infinite on the 25th of March. Thanks for your time. Cheers.